Today, we're talking about what do we do when we're overwhelmed with negativity, overwhelmed with feelings of depression, overwhelmed feeling like everything's going to pot. There's nothing good in the world. What am I going to do when I see, people making fun of my faith, when I see Catholics who are no longer say that they're Catholic, but are no longer following the tenets of the faith, when I see that there's our bishops who might actually seem to be lukewarm, who are not speaking out and saying, hey, I support us as Catholics. Sometimes we feel like they're not being the leaders that we're hoping for. Administratively, that's great, but we're looking for spiritual leaders. We're looking for somebody who's willing to speak the truth in spite of great opposition. And really, that's kind of the point of the bishops, right? So we look at history, we look at St. Paul or St. Peter, and say St. Paul too, but we look at the 12 apostles, though. The original 12 apostles, they were sent off into martyrdom. They weren't sent off into a life of luxury or a life of hobnobbing with politicians and things of that nature. We expect our bishops to say, hey, this is the truth of Christ. This is what Christ told us to do. Not what, the local dignitary told us to do or the person in office told us to do. That's not who we follow as Catholics. We follow Christ. And it can be overwhelming to feel like, hey, why are we talking about everything but Christ? Why is it that our prelates aren't speaking up and saying, well, this is what Christ has to say about this, in spite of great danger, in spite of great risk? That's kind of what we look for. That's what we hope for. But if we're starting to feel overwhelmed, we're starting to feel depressed, let's look at 4 different saints who also experienced depression in their lives, who experienced mental health hardships. And heck, maybe they can be a model for us to say, I can get better too. I can improve. Or how do I navigate my life even though I'm not feeling better? How do I continue to navigate my life for Christ? So the first saint is called Saint Dymphna. So if anybody's never heard of Saint Dymphna, she is the patron saint of depression. So this is what the article says on her. Saint Dymphna is the patron saint of those who struggle with depression or anxiety, which is why she's perhaps the most well-known and called upon saint for mental illness. It's probably true. She's the first one when it comes to, when I speak to psychiatrists or colleagues in mental health care. St. Dymphna is always right there. She's right up there for us. She lived during the 7th century in Ireland. Her father was not Catholic, and her mother died when she was relatively young. Let's see what it says here. After her mother's death, Dymphna's father experienced severe mental illness, and in his psychosis, wanted to marry Dymphna to replace her mother. Well, that has got to be confusing as all get out. And this is what happens, folks. This is where I think anybody who's lived with a loved one who's experienced mental illness, they know what's happening here. They've seen this. They say, anybody who hasn't experienced might be going, oh my gosh, that's too weird. That's off, especially, and of course it is, how can a father all of a sudden want to marry his daughter? But when mental illness is severe enough, when the psychosis is severe enough, the person's not thinking straight. They're not going to be thinking clearly. So then what does it say? It says St. Dymphna refused her father's propositions and fled to Belgium, and ultimately was beheaded by soldiers commanded by her father. What a life. This is where we got to ask ourselves, how is this possible? Why is this even, what happened here? St. Dymphna, all of a sudden her dad is not mentally well, right? And what does he do? He's got the command of soldiers, and as she runs away, she had the courage to run away. That's got to be tough because you're running away from your father. Aren't we supposed to respect our parents? Or does the 4th commandment tell us honor your father and mother? To what point? To the point where if you know that something's going on here where I'm going to do something sinful or against God's nature, I better get away. And that's what she did. She had the courage to say, no, I'm not going to do this. Even though she ran away, though, she was unfortunately beheaded. But why is she a saint? Because she kept her hope in God regardless of the consequences. I think this is what we're talking about when we're saying, hey, our prelates have to look around. And even if our leaders appear to be mentally ill, if they appear to not be thinking clearly, if they appear to be asking us to do things that go against our faith, sometimes we need to run away or, speak up for ourselves, even if it means that we're going to be beheaded at some point. That's a tough position to be in. But St. Dymphna is someone who gave us an example of, hey, I'm going to keep following God, and I'm not going to follow mental illness. I'm not going to follow somebody, even if it's my own father. I'm not going to follow his directive because I know better. I know what God wants, and I'm going to have to escape regardless of the consequences, because ultimately my whole goal is heaven, not earth. I got to get to heaven. And if that means that I have to die for my faith, that's how it's going to have to happen. Let's look at another saint, Saint Benedict Joseph Lebray. Saint Benedict Joseph Lebray was born in France in 1748 as one of 18 children. That's a lot of kids. That's a beautiful family, 18 children. The deepest desire of his youth was to become a priest. So he left home at a young age to study with his uncle, who was a priest. His uncle died, however, and Benedict subsequently tried and failed 10 times to join various religious communities. Well, let's see what happens. So he finally joins one. When he was finally accepted into a religious community, the way of life proved detrimental to his mental health, and he left after a neurosis made it impossible for him to continue. Well, how many times has this happened to us, folks? We think we want something, we have the desire in our hearts. It says here that St. Benedict Joseph Lebray, he tried to enter the priesthood in 10 different, 10 times to join various communities, was not happening. How many times do we say, no, this is what I want. This is what's going to happen for me. I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep trying. It finally happens. And then all of a sudden he fell into a neurosis. We think we got what we wanted. And all of a sudden there's conflict. There's evil of some sort. Something's out of sorts. Has that ever happened to anybody out there? Happens all the time. He ended up with a neurosis, made it impossible to continue. But then it says this: he found his true vocation, however, in becoming a pilgrim. So that's another thing to consider, folks. Sometimes we think we have our vocation. We're going to follow God. We think we know what the clear path in front of us, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And we think we're following it. And all of a sudden God says, nope, I've got a different path for you. That's not what you're kind of on the right path, but I need something different from you. And all of a sudden we find out what our true vocation is. There's what we think our vocation is, and then there's what God says, nope, this is what your vocation is. So this is what he says, or this is what happened to him. He found his true vocation, however, in becoming a pilgrim. He went on pilgrimages to all the major shrines in Europe. He was living in poverty along the way. He spent the last 6 years of his life in Rome. He was sleeping in the Colosseum at night and praying in various churches. Those who knew him in Rome quickly began recognizing him as a saint, and after his death at age 35, he was canonized in 1881. He is also the patron saint of the homeless. Well, hey, that's a great patron saint to know. If we're going to look at the patron saint of the homeless, we know there's been a big increase in our homeless population, and St. Benedict Joseph Lebray sounds like he had his heart in the right place. He was homeless too, but he had his heart in the right place. He was going to pray. He was doing good. He found his true vocation as just being a pilgrim. He was canonized a saint. It's funny how God uses our lives if we allow it to happen. I think God saw the fire in St. Benedict Joseph Lebray's heart. He saw that, gosh, you want to keep joining the priesthood. You want to keep doing this. You have a big loving heart for me. But sometimes we don't know what we don't know. We don't know if he would have joined the priesthood and changed or not been as holy. And God said, with that kind of fire, I'm going to send you on pilgrimages. What I wonder is, are some of the prayers that he was doing during his pilgrimages, are those helping me today? Is God sending some of that my way? Don't forget, folks, whatever we do now, I'm sure those prayers can be held and God can use them any way he wants. He can send them into the future and use them for people in the future. He can use them to help out people in the present, and he can even use them to help out people in the past, believe it or not. So everything's before God. There's no space and time. We limit ourselves in space and time. But I wonder if St. Benedict, with all his pilgrimages to all the major shrines in Europe, you know that when you're on pilgrimage, you're just praying. You're in constant prayer. You're constantly asking God for reparations. You're asking him for graces to be shed on all over the world. I wonder if he did that for us. I wonder how many of us are receiving some of those graces that he sent out. That's got to be a hopeful sign in times of feeling depression or despair, right? So these are things to consider. Let's look at the next saint, St. Louis Martin. St. Louis Martin is best known for being the saint father of the beloved St. Teresa of Lisieux. Right. So the little flower, this is her dad. He is a model for holy fatherhood. And boy, we need that today, don't we, folks? We need to look at what holy fatherhood is. We need to look at what's the role of the dad now, or what's always been the role of the dad. But what's the role of the dad in society and the family life? We forget the impact that dads have. We look at Mother's Day and we say, oh, moms are great. But let's look at the role of the father. That's a big deal. It says this: so he is the role model for holy fatherhood, and he and his wife are the only married couple ever canonized by the church. But he also may have experienced depression later in life. All 5 of his daughters grew up to join convents, and his wife died when she was only 45, right? And at that age, St. Teresa was 4 years old. So he began to display symptoms of mental illness not long after St. Teresa entered the convent. After experiencing symptoms of dementia, depression, speech impediments, episodes of fear, and even running away for days at a time, he was eventually placed in a mental hospital. This is what happens, folks. Just like I was saying, that lady I knew, her son went to the hospital. He's got a history of bipolar disorder. How many of us know people like this? How many of us know people who suffer from mental illness? They have depression, they have episodes of fear, they run away for days, and they end up in the mental hospital. Do we have that hope that it's a good thing? Let's go on to see what this says. It says, while he is a patron saint of widowers and parents, he also knew what it was like to experience depression, making him a great saint to turn to in the midst of mental health struggles. Remember, folks, just because people are in the hospital with mental health doesn't mean that they don't have a path to sainthood or that their life is over. Sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes we dismiss people. We say, oh, that guy's in jail, that guy's in the hospital, that guy's in a mental hospital. And we forget they still got to work towards sainthood just like we do, And sometimes if you think about it, we're all in our different prisons. We're all in our different hospitals. I don't have to be in the hospital building to be sick and to need healing. Yeah, the hospital is the extreme form of that we see, but how many of us are in our own sick bed every time we go to bed at night and we're not feeling good and we don't tell the world about it? How many of us need treatment? How many of us are in our own mental health hospital without being in a hospital? How many of us in our minds and in our hearts are not at peace, are feeling depression, are feeling off? It's no different, right? Where everybody's got different ways of being trapped, if you will, some physically, some emotionally, some mentally. But when it comes to all this is where we've got to have that hope. This is where I want to look up and see that rainbow and say, wait a minute, God still has a covenant for me. God still establishes that covenant with us, which means something good's going to happen in my life, which means that if I have hope, God is still going to use me in a way that's going to be very positive and that's going to influence other people to look towards God as well. I hope that can happen. I hope we can keep that hope. Well, the last saint from this little article, and I'm going to go ahead and link that article to our video, is Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. Saint Jane lived from 1572 to 1651 in France and was born to wealthy parents. She married and had 4 children herself, but her husband died in a hunting accident. After this, she fell into a deep depression, which was made worse when her difficult father-in-law insisted that she and her children move in with him. How many times does this happen? We start getting moved around and put in places we don't want to be. She saw a spiritual director, and guess who she met? She met St. Francis de Sales. Who knows St. Francis de Sales? He's an amazing saint, lots of books, and it says that when he came into her town during Lent to preach a retreat, she met him, and he offered guidance and counsel that helped her encounter the love and mercy of God. His work, so his book, Introduction to Devout Life, gave her great peace. Now, you know what's interesting here? This is what's interesting, and we might see it as kind of strange. We might say, wow, 2 saints came together into each other's sphere and space. So St. Jane is there, St. Francis is there, and all of a sudden they meet each other. And I think from the outside looking in, we kind of see it like 2 movie stars, 2 superstars, all of a sudden are in the same place. Wow, that's amazing, 2 saints. Well, this is a great reminder that we're all called to be saints. We're all called to sainthood. And really, we need to look at ourselves that way. When I'm in the presence of someone else, what does Christ say? Where 2 or more are gathered in my name, I'm present there. That's what happens with saints, right? You come in the name of Jesus. Everybody comes in the name of Jesus. Good things happen. I think when we're in each other's presence, we got to look at each other and say, wow, we're in the presence of saints. Not in an egotistical way, not in a way that says, oh, I'm so holy, look at me. But that's what God calls us to. I got to be a saint. I got to follow Christ. I'm going to follow Christ. This person who I'm in their presence is going to follow Christ. We're going to follow Christ together. Ah, good things are going to happen. There's going to be miracles that are going to happen. I'm going to be inspired. I might inspire them. I might be St. Jane, or I might be the St. Francis someone. You never know. That's the beauty of our faith. That's the beauty of the communion of saints, is that we're all connected through Christ. That's where our hope lies. That's where the rainbow is still there. That's where we are still God's people. We got to remember that God still has his covenant with us. How do we know that? Well, if we look at the gifts, the promises of the Sacred Heart, this is what it comes down to this month. Why do I say this? Because in the midst of darkness, Noah was in the flood and God gave him the rainbow. Is it over? Was that just for Noah? Or does God promise still continue? It still continues, folks, from here to eternity. From every generation that's born, God's promise is still going to continue. He's not going to be done with it. He's not going to end it. He's going to say, hey, this is for every single person. And even if your grandchild was the only person on earth, these promises still apply.